يشرفنا حضوركم اليوم في جمعيتكم. واليوم الجمعية الاقتصادية تستضيف السيد مارك فينلي، هو المدير العام لأسواق الطاقة والاقتصاد الأمريكي في شركة British Petroleum. Thank you, Mr. Mark, for being here with us in the Kuwait Economic Society, and our pleasure to host you with us.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me to come back to the Kuwait Economic Society to share BP's long-term world energy outlook, and I look very much forward to having a chance to discuss the energy prospects with the many experts that are here in the room today. And it's always a privilege for me to have a chance to visit Kuwait again, and again, thank you for your hospitality. So what I've gotten to share with you today is a presentation based on BP's annual long-term world energy outlook. And this is a product that you may be familiar, many of you who have been studying energy and economics may be familiar with the companion piece of work that BP publishes every year, an annual statistical review of world energy, which I think I've briefed here in the past as well. The statistical review is a booklet that comes out every June and looks backward at the historical data. And we build on that historical data to produce this annual energy outlook in two ways. The first way is the historical data that I have to share with you is based on our annual statistical review. But we also, as we put this outlook together, try to strive for the same spirit of being objective in our analysis. And so what I'm sharing with you today is not a projection of the world that we wish will happen, but rather our best effort to be as objective as we can be in describing the most likely trajectory for the world's energy system, based on the expected evolution of the world's economy and technology, and also how policy is likely to change. Now, it's good to be humble when you're doing a long-term forecast, and I'm sure many of the members of your group who have done forecasting will appreciate that. And so, it would be nice if in 20 years we could say we were right, but really the important thing is to, as you build the outlook, to understand what are some of the key drivers and some of the key decision points. And so, in addition to presenting our most likely case, we will also discuss some of the key uncertainties for the outlook as well. And hopefully, this will take about 40 minutes and leave us with lots of time for discussion. We'll begin with just a bit of data to set the context. What I'm showing you here is our projections for global economic growth, because the economy is a key driver of our demand for energy. So what I'm showing you here is that the world's economy more than doubles between now and 2035. And you can see that most of that growth is in the emerging economies, especially in Asia. By the way, we'll use this abbreviation throughout. The OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That is a group of mature economies in North America, Western Europe, and Japan. And as you can see, that's not where the action is for the economy or for energy demand, as we will see shortly. So on this chart, and I think I'm going to switch so that I can...
Yes,
yeah,
go.
I'm sorry, I'm half Italian, and so I have to walk and wave my hands when I talk. So what you can see on this chart is that Asia contributes most of the growth in the world's economy. And some of that growth is due to growing populations and a growing workforce. But the bigger part is due to productivity gains, as the countries like China and India become richer and adopt the best economic practices to continue to grow their economies. But there's not all economic growth is the same. So, we do project that economic growth will continue a bit slower in these economies, but the form of economic growth will change. And so, for example, China up until now, has focused its economic development on exporting heavy industry that is very intensive in its use of energy. We believe in the future, China's economic growth will increasingly focus on domestic consumption of goods and services which are less energy intensive. And the implications of this economic picture for energy demand are shown on this slide. This is our forecast for global energy demand. And by the way, we convert all forms of energy into the equivalent of a ton of oil, about 7.3 barrels, so that we can make comparisons between different forms of energy. On our data, global energy consumption grows by just under 40% between now and 2035. That's actually a slower annual growth rate than we have seen historically. Since the year 2000, global energy demand has grown about 2.5% per year, and we project that in our forecast it will grow by 1.5% per year, so much slower. And the biggest portion of that slowdown, once again, will take place in the emerging economies of Asia. These countries have grown their energy demand by about 7% annually since the year 2000. But in our forecast, they grow by 2.5%, much slower. And that slowdown is partly due to slower economic growth, but it's also due significantly to these economies becoming much more efficient in the way they use energy. And again, it's that change in the form of China's economic development that I mentioned earlier. This story of the change of how Asia consumes energy also has important implications for energy demand if we look at it by sector of the economy or if we look at it fuel by fuel. So by sector of the economy, up until now, the fastest growing segment of the world's energy demand has had a bit for industrial energy consumption. Again, driven by that rapid growth of very energy-intensive heavy industry in Asia. But in our forecast, industry is not the fastest growing sector. It grows by about 1.5% per year. And slightly faster growing is energy consumed in the other sector, which is buildings, houses, residential, commercial applications. By the way, it is still the case that transport is the slowest growing sector in our outlook. And we look at that in more detail when we talk about the oil market in our main outlook. On a fuel-by-fuel basis, every form of energy grows in our outlook. In the last 15 years, coal has been the fastest growing fossil fuel, again, related to China's very rapid economic development. But in our forecast, coal becomes the slowest growing fuel. Again, due to the change in China that we discussed. But also, we've reduced our forecast for coal consumption in Europe and in North America due to more aggressive environmental policies. And it's also true that in North America, coal is also losing market share to cheap natural gas due to the shale phenomenon. Natural gas is the fastest growing fossil fuel in our outlook and the only fossil fuel that will gain global market share. But the fastest growing group of fuels in our outlook are up here, renewable forms of energy, which grow by 6.5% per year, very rapidly, but from a very small base. And we'll look at that in more detail shortly as well. This chart shows the long-term changes in the market shares of the different forms of energy. So, oil today is the dominant fuel in the world, but oil has been losing market share globally for 40 years. And in fact, oil has lost market share every year for the last 14 years in a row. This is, oil is the most expensive fuel if you look at it just on the energy content basis, or the most expensive fossil fuel at least. And I like when economics actually works in the real world. It makes sense that people would try to use less of the most expensive fuel. And in our outlook, oil continues to lose market share, although it does retain the number one role.
The pre-tax or post-tax?
Just on the wholesale prices. So, not yet. I haven't looked at taxes. So what gains market share in our outlook? For many years it's been natural gas, and that continues. But the real fastest growth in our outlook is in renewable energies, which tripled their global market share to about 8% of the world's total. A few things that you can see very clearly, however. This is still a world that by 2035 is dominated by fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, in our outlook, account for 81% of the world's energy in 2035, down from about 85% today. But it's also interesting that we will have three fuels that will be kind of near each other as the #1 fuel in the world, and that's actually never happened before in recorded economic history. The world has always had one dominant source of energy. First it was wood, then it was coal, today it's oil, but we've never seen that before. And I think it poses an interesting security observation and challenge. What does energy security mean if the world no longer has a dominant form of energy? So far I've talked, when I mentioned sectors of the energy economy, I didn't mention electricity, and that was because we took electricity and pushed it through to the places where it gets used in the earlier chart. But behind the scenes, electricity is actually the key driver of energy demand in the world in our outlook. This chart shows you that by 2035, almost half of all of the energy consumed in the world will be used just to generate electricity. And power generation accounts for 60% of all of the growth in the world's energy demand in our forecast. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you where the power comes from. And you can see, well, let me back up. As an economist, I enjoy talking about power because that is the place where all of the fuels compete with each other. So we saw, for example, in the 1960s, oil was gaining market share dramatically, but as soon as the price shocks of the 70s hit, oil used in power generation has fallen very sharply. Coal has been the dominant fuel all along, but it has consistently been losing market share and continues to lose market share in our forecast. At first, gas lost market share, or coal lost market share to natural gas. But in the forecast, the real action is for renewable forms of energy and power generation, wind and solar, which will account for 15% of all of the world's power generation by 2035. Now, so far I've only talked about demand, and I'd like to spend a little while talking about supply as well. This is probably the only chart you will ever see that includes renewable energy, Canadian oil sands, and shale, both oil and gas, in the same chart. But there actually is a common theme that unites all of these fuels. 20 years ago, none of them was important in the world's energy mix. But today, all of them are growing very rapidly, and they're all being driven by rapid technological innovation, and they're all being facilitated by government policy, by helpful government policies. And we project that these forms of energy will continue to grow rapidly, and in fact, just the forms of energy presented on this chart will account for almost half of all of the growth in the world's energy production in our forecast. And we can look at them in a bit more detail. First, I want to look at the shale dynamic, and I'm sure many of you have been looking at it very closely as well. This chart shows the technically recoverable shale resources in the world. And for context, to help you understand how big these numbers are, the green areas, representing tight oil, are slightly bigger than Saudi Arabia's proved oil reserves. So that's a big number. But you can see that the red area is even bigger. The gas technically recoverable resources are bigger than the world's current proved reserves for natural gas. So these are huge numbers. You can also see that these resources are distributed all around the world. And yet, North America has dominated the story so far. And in fact, in our outlook, North America will continue to dominate. By 2035, it'll still be the case that about 2/3 of the shale production will still be in North America. So the question is, why did it grow so rapidly in North America? and why do we not expect it to be duplicated around the world? First, let me be clear. We do expect to see a significant contribution of shale from other parts of the world, and we'll see that shortly, but not as big as what we've seen in North America. And when we think about the factors that allowed for the rapid development of shale in the United States, is there a big competitive domestic industry with hundreds of players that are pushing to innovate and compete? Is there a large service industry that can bring lots of skilled labor and equipment into the discussion? Is there a financial market that can provide financing and hedging opportunities? Is there a pipeline network already there that you can feed your production into, and a large domestic demand market to make it easy to sell your product? Importantly, is there a government policy framework that allows investment to take place? And is there a system of ownership of private property, for example, that allows the farmer to benefit when shale resources are developed on the farmer's land? When we make a list of all the factors that were behind the rapid development in North America, this simply isn't repeated elsewhere around the world. Individual countries have some of those factors, but nobody has all of them together. Now, the fact that these resources are so big suggests that if we're wrong about shale, it could be that we're wrong by being too conservative on prospects outside of North America. Another important dimension of this is that we do believe that resources could eventually become a constraining factor on the growth of production. So on our data, the growth of production for oil begins to slow down and level off. It gets to a plateau in the middle years of our outlook. And that's because the resources become a constraint. By 2035, half of that technically recovered resource estimate would have been produced in our outlook. Now, this assumes, of course, that these estimates are accurate, and it's good to be careful about that. But natural gas is a much bigger resource, and so we have natural gas production continuing to grow throughout our forecast. And by 2035, about a third of the gas resource will have been produced in North America. For the rest of the world, we will have produced less than 5% of the shale resources by 2035.
Is this source rock?
It's right. It's the shale deposits.
How come at least it doesn't have any title on it? I mean, you have a lot of
Hawaii, the Middle East. Well, so let me.
shale rock is there?
Yeah. So these are estimates produced by the International Energy Agency, and in their report they say they haven't bothered to assess the potential for the Middle East because there's so much conventional resource remaining that why would you go after expensive source rock if you have lots of conventional resource? So they simply said, we didn't really look, because we figured there's not a need to. We could be interested to get your thoughts on that, but that was their explanation. Now, the other bit of rapidly growing production that I mentioned is renewables. Here I'm showing you renewables in power generation. And you can see the share of power that comes from renewables is growing rapidly. We think Europe is on track to meet its targets, broadly speaking, for the use of renewables in power generation. But look who else is on this chart. China actually accounts for the biggest growth of renewable energy in the world in our outlook. Partly that's because China is becoming richer and can afford the policies that are needed to help these very expensive sources of energy grow. But also in our outlook, they become less expensive. As these economies of scale are achieved, as wind and solar grow rapidly, the costs become more competitive. By the way, we also do assume in our outlook that there will be new policies adopted to deal with pollution, for example, in local pollution in China, to begin to deal with policies for climate change, and those all also work to support the development of renewable energy in our outlook. What I'll do next is move into a discussion of the oil market, and then we'll do natural gas, and then we'll move into a discussion of the uncertainties of our outlook. So first for oil, the way to read this chart is we start with the level of global demand and supply in 2013, which is the base year for our forecast, and then we show you total changes between now and 2035. So we believe that oil demand in Western Europe, North America, and Japan, the mature economies, peaked in 2005, has been in a structural decline for the last decade, and will generally continue to decline for the next 20 years. But all of those declines in consumption will be offset by growth in one country, China, which becomes the biggest consumer of oil in the world in our forecast. And then you add in the growth that we expect in other emerging economies, including here in the Middle East. And again, this is an important story, and I'm sure many of you know it very well, that the Middle Eastern oil and gas producers are increasingly consuming more of that oil and gas at home. And that they're an important source of the growth of demand for oil, and as we will see, for natural gas as well. So where does the demand or supply come from to meet that growth of demand? And even though oil grows pretty slowly in our forecast, total growth by 2035 is still 19 million barrels a day. That's roughly equivalent to today's U.S. oil consumption. So it's a big number. On our forecast, the growth of supply to meet that comes from two different waves. The first wave is rapid growth of unconventional supply, especially tight oil in the United States. But eventually, as I mentioned, tight oil growth begins to slow down and plateau in the United States, and later in our outlook, we see more growth of production coming out of OPEC, both crude oil and liquids associated with the production of natural gas as well. And let's think about those two distinct phases of the oil market in a bit more detail. Actually, here, let me clean it up. So, in the last few years, we've seen dramatic growth of U.S. tight oil, and we're projecting that growth will continue at slower rates through around 2020. And I'm sure many of you know this story, but the numbers have been truly amazing. You know, for each of the last 3 years, the United States has had, each year, the biggest growth in domestic oil production ever in its history. Last year's growth was 1.5 million barrels a day, twice the growth rate of global demand last year. And as we show in the energy outlook that we have provided with you, it was also one of the biggest increases of oil production the world has ever seen. Only Saudi Arabia has ever had a bigger one-year increase in oil production than the U.S. had last year. So, with such strong growth in tight oil driven by the United States, and by the way, also rapid growth in the production of natural gas liquids, also largely driven by the shale phenomenon, the market has actually needed less oil from OPEC. Now, much of that reduction has come through supply disruptions in recent years, but even so, the market has become oversupplied and oil prices have declined. And by the way, we think that state of being oversupplied could last for several years. And we can talk more about that later if you like. But eventually, we do believe that the oil market will grow out of that today's oversupplied state. You know, in the later years of our forecast, the growth rate for tight oil slows down in the United States, and that creates headroom for a more even distribution of the growth of oil production around the world, including, you know, additional growth of production from OPEC. So by 2035, in our data, OPEC's share of global oil production is about 40%, which is exactly what it has averaged for the last 20 years. So certainly in the United States where I live, there's a lot of press commentary today about, oh, OPEC is irrelevant. And our data says OPEC is still very relevant. Another important dimension of our oil market outlook is what it means for shifting trade flows around the world. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this as well. You know, the old map for the oil market was that oil was produced here and went to hungry markets in Europe and the United States. So the oil flowed from east to west. That's changing, and it's going to change dramatically in our forecast. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you regional balances. The way to read this chart is the regions above zero are exporters of oil, and regions below are importers of oil. So North America has been dramatically reducing its imports. In the next few years, we believe North America will become a net exporter of oil. And all of the growth of oil imports in our forecast go to Asia, which will account for 80% of the world's net oil imports by 2035. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the implications of our outlook for oil import dependence in the U.S., China, and India. So you know already the United States has dramatically reduced its import dependence, falling domestic demand, rising domestic supply. China last year passed the U.S. as the biggest importer of oil in the world. In another couple of years, India will pass the United States. And we believe that the United States is on a trajectory, on a path to become self-sufficient in oil in the later years of our forecast. And by the way, the amount of import dependence that we're projecting for China is bigger than anything that ever happened in the United States, both in absolute terms and as a percent of domestic consumption. Let me turn next to natural gas. I mentioned earlier that natural gas is the fastest growing fossil fuel in our outlook. Here's the data. We have supply on the left and demand on the right. So a big chunk of the growth comes from shale. In fact, half of the growth in global production comes from shale. Once again, you can see that most of that comes from the mature economies of the OECD, and mainly that's North America. But this means that half of the growth in global production does not come from shale. It comes from conventional production in the emerging economies. The two biggest chunks of that are in Russia and here in the Middle East. But there's an important difference. The growth in production in Russia gets exported. Russia remains the biggest exporter of energy in the world in our outlook. But the growth of production in the Middle East is all consumed at home. And I'm sure you all can tell me more about that. On the demand side, we see growing consumption in many parts of it, but the most rapid growth is in power generation, as gas continues to displace coal, in particular in power generation. One item that we're looking at with interest in the natural gas story is the growing importance of liquefied natural gas trade. And I'm showing you on the left our projections. Global trade of liquefied natural gas more than doubles in our forecast. And you see the key growth increments here. On our data, both Australia and the United States will pass Qatar as the biggest exporters of liquefied natural gas in the world. We also see significant growth from both existing and new producers in Africa. And the growth of LNG comes in two separate stages. We see very rapid growth in the next couple of years from plants that have already been, are already under construction. But then we think the liquefied natural gas markets could become a bit oversupplied after that growth. And so we think the growth rate of new supply will slow down for a little while before recovering toward the end of our outlook. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you, this is the share of total natural gas that gets traded across an international boundary. So about 1/3 of today's natural gas production is traded internationally. By the way, for oil, it's 2/3. But look, in our outlook, it stops. Does that mean that natural gas markets will stop integrating around the world? Not quite. Because what you can see is that what slows down is the growth of pipeline trade, but the growth of liquefied natural gas keeps growing rapidly. In fact, natural gas trade by liquefied natural gas actually passes pipeline in the later years of our outlook. And that growing trade of liquefied natural gas provides a degree of flexibility that pipelines don't have. A pipeline will take the gas from me to you. But an LNG tanker can turn left or right when it leaves the export terminal, depending on where the price signal sends it. So we believe that this rapid growth of liquefied natural gas has the potential to begin to link more closely international natural gas markets. Another important dimension of liquefied natural gas is what it means for energy security. And I've got a particular example here from Europe. What I'm showing you is Europe's natural gas consumption and how it gets met. So today, half of Europe's natural gas is produced domestically and half is imported. Most of what's imported comes from pipelines, and of that, the vast majority comes from Russia. In our outlook, natural gas consumption grows, but domestic production keeps falling. It's a mature province, and we think the shale prospects are limited. So the bad news is Europe becomes significantly more import dependent. About 2/3 of Europe's gas will be imported by 2035. The potential good news is that there's more diversity of supply in the form of rapid growth of liquefied natural gas. So that provides potentially a bit more flexibility and a bit more diversity of supply for European consumers, even as they become more import dependent. Let me move next to the final section, which focuses on some of the key uncertainties. These are the uncertainties that we address in the full outlook, which is available to you. But for the presentation, I'm going to focus only on the top two. And the first of those is, what if economic growth in Asia isn't as fast as we think it will be? Some of you may be aware of recent work by the former U.S. Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers saying there is no historical precedent for a country to grow faster than the world average forever. And so his idea is China can't sustain rapid economic growth forever. So we thought, all right, what if we just reduced economic growth in China and India by 1 percentage point? Essentially, that would reduce projected economic growth from 5% to 4%. So not a big change. What would the implications be for energy? They're big implications. So by taking 1% out of economic growth for 25 years, we reduce GDP in Asia by about 25%. And we reduce energy demand accordingly. But when we reduce economic growth here, guess what? Economic growth falls in other parts of the world too, because the world is all connected. So we have to think about the global implications of lower economic growth in Asia. And globally, it would reduce economic growth by about 13%, and it would reduce global energy consumption relative to our base case by 8%, which is equivalent to removing the European Union from the world's energy mix. So it's a big change for a pretty small change in economic growth. On the right, I show you which fuels are most impacted. Not surprisingly, the fuels that are most impacted are the fuels that are the biggest ones in Asia's energy mix: coal and oil. To me, the one interesting question was, why do renewables get hit so badly in this scenario? The way we rationalized it is this. If you're 25% poorer, you have 25% less money to spend on subsidies for the expensive fuels. The other factor we wanted to address was climate change. And we asked ourselves, well, what in our framework can we add to the international discussion of climate change in the run-up to the talks at Paris later this year? It seems to me that you can break CO2 emissions into two components. The first is how much energy do you need to run your economy. The second is how much carbon do you need to make up your energy mix. So I'm showing you those components here. So let's think about them in turn. First, I don't know if that showed up very well, but it's colored. Let's think about the relationship between the growth of the economy and the growth of energy consumption. And we talked about this earlier. In our data, the world's economy doubles. Energy consumption grows by 40%. The result, you can see it. A huge gap opens up between energy and the economy. On the other hand, not so much of a gap opening up between energy and CO2 emissions, which grow, by the way, by about 25% in our outlook. So the question is, oh, by the way, of this small improvement in the carbon content of our energy mix, about half comes from the growth of renewables. The other half comes from gas gaining market share from coal. So to me, the obvious question is, why do we see a big gap here? And why do we not see a big gap here? Well, I'm talking to the Economic Society, right? My idea is there's already a big expense. There has, for a long time, been a big incentive to become more efficient in the way we use energy relative to our economy, because energy is expensive. And the people who become more efficient are the ones who win in the global economic competition. On the other hand, by and large, carbon is not expensive. And so there's not an incentive to reduce the carbon content of the world's energy mix. By the way, we do have new climate policies coming into effect in our outlook, but relatively modest. You know, the equivalent of a carbon price of about $40 a ton. So, what does that mean for total CO2 emissions from energy in our outlook? Here's the data. They grow by 25%. The red dotted line is what the climate scientists say the trajectory should look like if we were to limit atmospheric concentrations to the 450 parts per million. So you can see we're not on the trajectory. So last year we used a kind of a quick soundbite to help put some of these dynamics in context, and we said, you know, if you just switched 1% of the world's power generation from coal to natural gas, that would be the same carbon benefit as growing all of the renewables in the world by 11%. Just, of course, because renewables are so small in the total. So we asked ourselves this year, can we build on that? So here is a list of changes in the world's energy system that would have the same impact in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. This is not the BP policy wish list or the recommendations. These are just, you know, us as economists finding some ideas that we can put out there for conversational purposes. So each of these steps would reduce CO2 emissions by an equivalent amount to switching 1% of the world's power generation away from coal and toward natural gas. And you can see there are some here that are aimed at the efficiency side of it. There are some here that are aimed at changing the carbon content of the energy mix. But here's the real eye-opener. Each one of these options would reduce CO2 emissions at today's energy mix by about 100 million tons of carbon. That gap is 20 billion tons. So you would need 200 of these steps to solve the climate problem. So for us, there are two big observations that come from that. Observation number one is there's no silver bullet, there's no magic wand, there's no one thing that the world can do that says, well, this will fix climate. You need a whole bunch of different approaches. The second observation is, do you have confidence that you can pick which one of these would work and which ones won't? You know, our track record for that is not good. And I have to say, as we consult with technology experts all over the world, everyone has a different opinion. So to think that we could ask our policymakers to pick which of these ahead of time are going to be the winning approaches is a pretty tough challenge. When you put those two things together, that you need a lot of steps and it's hard to pick the winners, it suggests to us that the appropriate answer is a global price of carbon, which would create a playing field for producers and consumers and entrepreneurs and innovators to all bring their ideas to test them to see which ones are the most effective. So let me wrap up, and hopefully we have time for discussion. Since 2011, from 2011 until the middle of 2014, oil prices were not only historically high, they were historically stable. And, you know, I don't know about you all here in Kuwait, but, you know, for BP, we kept saying, don't get used to it, because the world isn't stable. You know, the world's all about change, right? So, you know, we've, you know, in our outlook, it reflects significant change. You know, changes in the places where energy gets produced and the way places where energy gets consumed, the types of things that get consumed and how they get used in relation to the economy, how energy flows around the world. You know, ours is a world of significant change in the energy system. The one place where you could argue we don't see enough change is on the climate front. With that, why don't I wrap up? Again, there's much more detail available at our website, and I've given the web address here. I thank you very much for your hospitality. I hope this is a useful addition to the discussion of energy in Kuwait, and I think we have time for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.